Ernie Hopkins, I know is here. Barb Jarmoska is our speaker today. I called her back when we were having the ice flows to ask what the title of her speech was going to be, and I got this message on her machine that the waters were rising, that she was out rounding the animals up to get them into the barn, but that nobody should be concerned. And I thought, oh dear, is she going to be able to get back to me at all? The next day, here she is on the phone, and I thought, this is an interesting woman. She has been, has served on the board of directors of the Responsible Dwelling Alliance for 7 years. The Responsible Dwelling Alliance is an education advocacy coalition which seeks to educate themselves and the public about deep shale gas drilling and all its ramifications. The title of her talk is Natural Gas, Unnatural Consequences. Please welcome Barbara Jarmoska.
Thank you, Mary. Hold your applause until the end. Maybe there's nothing to really applaud about. Thank you for that great introduction. Yes, my animals and I survived the recent high water. We have survived 2 floods in the last 10 years that I have been living on a beautiful mile of property that has a beautiful stretch of the Loyalsock Creek. River of the Year. Yay us. So I am very grateful to be here. That is my thank you to you. I don't know if it would behoove us if we even could dim the lights just a little bit. There's a lot of photographs in this presentation. If it's possible to, if they're on a dimmer switch, that would be terrific. If they're not, it's fine. I am going to figure out a way to juggle a microphone and some notes and the computer here and change slides. So I want to start by thanking the League of Women Voters who sponsored the Shale and Public Health Conference in Pittsburgh last year. I was not able to attend this conference, but I honor and am very grateful for the League's position on unconventional gas drilling. I honor and am very grateful for the work of the League for many, many years. I did look it up, and the League of Women Voters is 98 years old, so in 2 years you will have a great big 100-year anniversary celebration. So thank you for being a part of a very rich and valuable history of taking an active role in our democracy. And thank you, when it comes to shale gas, for having the courage as an organization to speak the truth. I want to tell you that I'm not here as an expert. I am not a geologist or an engineer. I am a school teacher and a business owner and a wellness coach, and I have been a member of the board of directors and been studying gas drilling for the past 8 years. I have been following advice that I got from Mary Oliver. And she says this is instructions for living a life. Oliver's exquisite poetry focuses on the quiet occurrences of nature. Industrious hummingbirds, grasshoppers, egrets, motionless ponds, lean owls hunkering with lamp eyes, with apologies to Mary on what is no doubt a gross misinterpretation of the word astonished. I have been astonished and appalled at what has been happening in the beautiful region where I live. I cannot help but be appalled how we are treating the planet that sustains us. But I have been paying attention, and I have been telling others, and I am very honored to have that opportunity to be here with you today to do that once again. I live in Lycoming County in a northern rural part of the county on a no-outlet country road that dead ends into the Loyalsock State Forest. My appalled, angry, and admittedly frightened response to the sudden gas industry invasion that began back in 2010 in my neighborhood, that began back then, so that's been 8 years ago. I live on 20 unleased acres that border the Loyalsock Creek, as I said, for a mile. My grandfather bought that land in 1933, and so we now have 5 generations of treasured memories. It is a rare thing to have those kinds of family roots today, and I am deeply grateful for it. Unfortunately, the quiet rural life that we had come to know came to an end back in 2008. That is my mailbox, that is my fence, and that truck had a Louisiana license plate, and behind that truck is my driveway. So in order to even leave home, I had to get a flag car that was put there to monitor gas industry traffic to leave. I went out to my mailbox one day, and there was a porta potty on my land. No one had asked me if they could put it there. This is how close the trucks were coming to that porta potty. So I was standing when I took this picture at that mailbox that I showed you in the previous slide, looking at the traffic coming down. It is, for all intents and purposes, a 1-lane country road that was turned into 2 lanes. We did have one fairly serious accident, but it was it's a harrowing time when the gas industry comes into your rural neighborhood. This is a picture of my son and granddaughter taken 8 years ago on one of our favorite hiking trails in the Loyalsock State Forest, again, before the gas industry brought the trucks and the gravel and turned that hiking trail into a road to what is 2 gas well pads now on top of our hill, and is permitted for many more. And because I believe it's healthier all around to turn anger to activism than to resentment, I became involved with the Responsible Drilling Alliance, and here I am still paying attention, still being astonished, and still telling others. And so my talk is indeed entitled Natural Gas: Unnatural Consequences. This is a new PowerPoint for me. I had an old one that I traveled around the state of Pennsylvania and New York presenting from about 2008 to 2011, and I decided rather than try to tweak that, I did a complete overhaul. And so I need to alert you that I don't have any idea how long this is going to take, because I didn't practice. I know I have till 12:45. I also know that some of you will need to leave. Emma, I know you have class. And anyone else, please do not feel that I will be insulted. I am the one that is taking your time. I will do this until it's completed and then be happy to stay for questions. In thinking about the unnatural consequences of gas, I came up with 13. This is in no way is this a comprehensive list. It is the 13 consequences that I am most familiar with. I'm going to run down each of these and give you some details. The first of which are the exemptions. Many of you may be somewhat familiar with the fact that the gas industry has been exempted from 7 federal laws, and here they are. The Safe Water Drinking Act requires permits for underground injections of hazardous substances unless that hazardous substance is frac fluid, which is fresh water mixed with a cocktail of over 500 possible chemicals, many of which are classified as carcinogens, endocrine disruptors, and neurotoxins. The Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, also known as its acronym RCRA, sets standards for the disclosure and safety in handling hazardous waste. Gas industry fracking waste had to be completely reclassified to get this exemption. In any other industry, what is coming back up out of the well after the frack job is completed would be classified as hazardous, but for the gas industry, it is reclassified as residual waste, which means that they do not have to follow the laws that are required if it were labeled what it accurately is, as toxic or hazardous waste. The Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act, also known is the act that is responsible for what is called the TRI, or Toxic Release Inventory. This act requires companies to report the release of significant levels of toxic substances to the EPA's toxic release inventory, or TRI, you guessed it, the gas industry does not have to report what it is releasing to the EPA. RDA, the Responsible Drilling Alliance, is currently a plaintiff in a lawsuit that we have filed against the EPA. The results are not out yet, but our demand, of course, is that the gas industry be required to report its toxic releases in the same way that every other industry must. The Clean Water Act sets standards for stormwater discharge. However, once again, the oil and gas industry is exempt from this act, despite the increasingly significant runoff from thousands of well pads, pipelines, and other infrastructures. The Clean Air Act limits emissions of nearly 190 toxic pollutants, including many emitted by the gas companies. The tricky exemption here has to do with aggregation. Smaller sources of emissions grouped together that produce pollution above certain thresholds are generally covered by this act. This aggregation requirement is designed to protect the public from smaller sources that on their own could be relatively harmless, but collectively release large quantities of toxic substances. And so we have clustered together in gas industry operations well pads, glycol dehydrators, compressor stations, pipelines, LNG filling stations, odorizing stations, wastewater treatment facilities. All of these are frequently clustered, and yet they are not, under the Clean Air Act, treated as an aggregate unit because of this exemption. The National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, was enacted in 1969. It requires the industries to conduct environmental impact statements before their activities. The gas industry's exemption was passed in 2005. Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability, or CERCLA, is better known as the Superfund Act. This law allows potentially responsible parties to be held liable for cleanup costs for massive releases of toxic substances and the creation of a Superfund site. The gas industry, should something that horrific happen, is exempt. Those are the exemptions the industry has enjoyed. Currently, the rollbacks continue. In May of last year, EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt stated his intention to offer the oil and gas industry a 2-year suspension on the new source pollution standards for air emissions that create ozone. And just this month, February of 2018, Pruitt also proposed the repeal of a plan known as WOTUS, W-O-T-U-S, Waters of the United States. This plan limits pollution in America's wetlands. This is a particular problem for the gas industry because of the number of wetlands through which they are building pipelines. But thanks to Pruitt, there is now a 2-year moratorium on enforcing that law, making the WOTUS law no more than a piece of paper, and the wetland protection is off the books. Here on the state level, we have currently a package of 5 bills that have fortunately not yet passed, but pay attention and tell others this is a horrific set of legislation, in my opinion. House Bill 1237, also called Kill Regulation by Doing Nothing. The General Assembly would be required to vote on concurrent resolutions to approve an economically significant regulation, and if they failed to vote, that regulation would not go into effect. House Bill 1959 would take permit reviews of gas industry permit applications away from DEP and other state agencies, and put them in the hands of private parties. HB 1960, the new regulatory compliance officers with the authority to waive fine laws. This requires every state agency to appoint a new position called a regulatory compliance officer, and to empower that officer with the full authority to waive any fines or penalties. HB 209, the Office of the Repealer and Moratorium on New Regulations. I swear this one sounds like something straight out of a Harry Potter novel. This bill would establish an independent Office of the Repealer to undertake an ongoing review of existing regulations and make recommendations for repeal. This is patterned very much like Trump's executive order to the EPA. This bill would require the repeal of 2 existing regulations for every new one that was added. And finally, the repeal any regulation by resolution, shown here in red, because I believe it is particularly egregious. Once again, modeled after a federal procedure used successfully by the current administration to repeal regulations. I'm going to quote the sponsor of the man who wrote this bill, whose name is up there. And I quote, "President Trump has had great success in preventing the implementation of many intrusive regulations at the federal level. Regulations are often an impediment to economic growth. Our legislation will give the PA General Assembly the ability to initiate the removal of decades of obstructive regulations that are currently disrupting the lives of taxpayers in the Commonwealth." Health and safety concerns continue to grow and amass. The most recent statistical analysis of the body of scientific literature by the Concerned Professionals of New York and Physicians for Social Responsibility reported that among the now 685 plus peer-reviewed papers examining gas drilling, an overwhelming majority of studies have found evidence or potential adverse impacts on water, air, and human health. The Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection has determined that there are 301 cases of private well water contamination from drilling. There have been over 4,400 water complaints related to gas activity filed by Pennsylvania citizens. And between 2004 and 2016, DEP now lists a total of 9,443 public complaints about a myriad of health and environmental problems in shale drilling areas. Our neighbor to the north, the New York Department of Health, concluded that, quote, "The overall weight of evidence has demonstrated the likelihood that adverse health outcomes and environmental impacts from high-volume hydraulic fracturing cannot be prevented." This conclusion led to a ban that remains in effect today. The state of Maryland has permanently banned fracking after 2 years of study, again, based on the potential for adverse public health and environmental impacts. At this point, there are hundreds of municipalities, regions, and entire countries that have banned unconventional drilling for methane due to the growing preponderance of evidence for harm and long-term negative consequences. Every year, 500,000, 500,000 days of school are missed by children due to the health impacts of air quality linked directly to oil and gas pollution. Fracking has brought oil and gas development into our backyards and communities, besides schools, playgrounds, daycare centers, and nursing homes. The industrialization of areas where people live, work, and play has greatly increased the potential for human exposure to new contaminants and threats. This is the compressor station that is closest to my house. That picture is not out of focus. That is the volatile organic compounds that arise from the compressor that distort the view in the background. These are odorless, tasteless, colorless, toxic gases that escape that can do harm but are invisible unless you are looking at something through them. This is the well pad along Route 87. You can see over in the far corner, there in the far right corner, the top of a gazebo that is a picnic pavilion where children play and have picnics at the nearby church. They were flaring the well when I took this picture. There's the close-up of the picnic pavilion that shows and how close it is to that mound of dirt beside the well pad, and that is how close the drill rig was to the classroom, the Sunday school classroom at the church. Current setback laws in Pennsylvania are only 500 feet from a school, a church, a nursing home, a daycare center, to try to push those to at least a mile, and we lost that battle. When it comes to water quality, I refer you back to the exemptions I discussed earlier and the fact that lack of regulatory oversight, especially via the Clean Water Act, absolutely puts our water supply at risk. The process of gas drilling that I'm talking about here is officially dubbed high-volume slick water hydraulic fracturing. Therefore, it is nicknamed fracking. High volume, I'll say, the volume of fresh water demanded by the gas industry is really impossible to wrap your brain around. On average, one well requires 4 to 8 million gallons of water. Tank trucks line up at our rivers 24/7 to deliver water to well pads. Well pads located near streams flood. Again, Very minor setbacks. There are well pads allowed in floodplains. There are well pads allowed where you would not be allowed to build any permanent structure. Tank trucks carrying chemicals leak. This is a picture of the back road to my house that was closed for 2 days because a truck carrying chemicals leaked all of its contents out onto the road. And they had to close the road. DEP showed up in hazmat suits with high-pressure hoses and squirted it all off. This road is very near the Loyalsock Creek, and the article in the paper said, and truly this, I can't make this up. DEP claimed they were not sure what the chemical was, but guaranteed that it was not harmful to human health or the environment. That's what the local paper said. So, wastewater, tank trucks have accidents. Chemicals leak into streams. Wastewater, we know, is being illegally dumped into cornfields under cover of darkness. There were arrests made in Lycoming County for just that thing several years ago. To date, in Pennsylvania alone, the gas industry has used 89,500,000,000 gallons of water in the fracking process for the wells that have already been drilled and fracked. That equates to 10,176,644 18-wheel tanker truck loads of water, some of whom you saw in a previous slide driving up my road. From this once fresh water, 11,353,383,315 gallons of liquid waste has thus far been produced by the Pennsylvania Marcellus, and these figures are new this month, February 2018. What will be the long-term consequences of the thousands of cement-sealed drill bores piercing our aquifers? Cement fails. Look at an old sidewalk. Some fails immediately, causing methane migration. 60% of the cement casing fails in the first 2 decades, and 100% will fail over time. I talked to a cement manufacturer at a symposium on drilling in Philadelphia that I attended a number of years ago, and I said, do you guarantee the efficacy of your cement sealing on wells? And he said, of course not. We can't. Cement will disintegrate. These well bores are not hollow or empty. They contain the same toxic wastewater that is being hauled by the billions of gallons and forced into injection wells to try to get rid of it. 100 years from now, when the cement has crumbled underground, what will the impact be on our aquifers? This is Dr. Tony Ingraffia of Cornell University. He has been sounding the alarm on this for many years now, believing that the promise of a total lack of wellbore integrity a century from now may indeed be the most horrific consequence of our current rush to drill. When it comes to water quality, I invite you to consider this. There is a complete ban on gas drilling in Pennsylvania, to our east, in the Delaware water basin, shown here. Why is that? The risk of contaminating a watershed that provides drinking water to 15 million people is just too great to take a chance on. Here in the Susquehanna Basin, no problem. There's not as many of us to worry about if things go wrong. Erosion and sediment poses a challenge with all phases of gas development. In 2012, the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection was required by the legislature to operate under a mandated expedited permit review process. This means that they must allow for a very fast turnaround when a permit application comes into the office. They have 2 weeks to study it and to approve it, and if they don't, it gets approved automatically. For well pads over 5 acres, no sediment and erosion plan is even needed. It is little wonder that there are many 4.75 to 4.9 acre well pads in this state where no permit was needed to deal with any runoff that may occur, and this is the well on Yeagle Road where a whole bunch of runoff occurred about a month ago. 55,000 gallons of frac fluid ran off this pad and into a nearby tributary that then fed into our beloved Loyalsock Creek. Heavy rains, floods, runoff containing spilled fracking chemicals, and diesel fuel for small well pads. No silt snakes or plan is required. The boom-bust cycle is a defining characteristic of the resource extraction economy, a feedback loop that often locks communities into economic dependency. Once locked in, it is very difficult to break free, and busts are especially detrimental to smaller towns with less diversity. That bust can mean huge losses for individuals, families, and communities, causing direct and long-lasting effects on the affected municipalities and regions. Boom-bust is never a good way to grow an economy. I looked at 15 published research studies when I was preparing this talk, each of them on the social impacts of gas drilling. I'd like to read a quote from one such study published by the Environmental Health Policy Institute. This report is not only an excellent representation of the sum total of the research findings as a whole, I found that it was completely true of my personal experience. And I quote, "Gas drilling brings undeniable changes to the social fabric of communities. Thousands of diesel-powered trucks carrying water, chemicals, and equipment to and from drilling sites roar through towns and rural landscapes, creating traffic jams and degrading road surfaces. Local hotels, temporary industry-built man camps, and restaurants are filled with an influx of drilling teams that arrive long enough to drill and frack and then move on to the next site. Social service providers, law enforcement personnel, town leaders, and longtime residents talk of additional stressors that often lie below the surface. Homelessness is on the rise among those who have long struggled near the economic margins and are forced from inexpensive housing by landlords seeking higher rents from gas workers. Tensions arise between the mailbox millionaires, for whom leasing of mineral rights has created new economic opportunities, and residents who do not have the desire nor the acreage to lease. A percentage of gas workers consistently behaves recklessly, and DUI arrests, prostitution, and drug use increases with communities. Locals who once relished their lives in the quiet rural areas struggle with the industrial landscape that surrounds them and is beyond their control. The total land disturbance for a single well pad averages 30 acres. This includes the land that must be cleared for the pad itself, as well as the access roads and infrastructure needed to transport, compress, and odorize the gas. Based on the vegetation distribution of this region, we can expect that 22 of these acres, on average, are currently forested land. Taking all of these factors into consideration, a total disturbance of up to 200,000 acres in the Susquehanna River Basin may well be a conservative estimate, depending on the energy choices we make in the coming years. Fragmenting of forest land will be with us for generations to come, as replacing 100-year-old trees does not happen quickly. To date, 90% of the acreage sacrificed to gas drilling remains an industrial site. Along with forest fragmentation comes the challenge of invasive species. As a whole, this is an enormously widespread challenge that you don't hear much about, but it does cost U.S. taxpayers more than $120 billion in damages every year. In July of last year, a study on gas drilling and invasive species was conducted by Penn State. It was paid for by the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, DCNR, and it showed that gas drilling in Pennsylvania has indeed spurred an increase in invasive species of plants colonizing near well pads, roads, and pipelines. Seeds of invasives like phragmites, also known as common reed, bush honeysuckle, Japanese knotweed, and Japanese silkgrass are being brought onto well pads on the tires and undersides of thousands of trucks that visit the sites and the gravel that is delivered to build well pads and roads. Invasive species rob fish, plants, and wildlife of both nutrients and space. The vast reserves of methane in the Marcellus and Utica shale layers are in the early stages of development, Yet this research reports that invasive species have already made, and I quote, significant inroads into the ecology of well sites and are now actively damaging native species. The flora and fauna of Penn's Woods is also under assault. Millions of small, colorful songbirds that live in the tropics for most of their year venture north each spring to Pennsylvania to nest in our deep, quiet forests that are being transformed into industrial zones for methane extraction. Most of these neotropical migrant birds cannot nest successfully in small woodlots. Their very survival depends on large, undisturbed tracts of woodland known as core forest, far removed from any permanent edge, such as a road or pipeline right-of-way. Well pad roads open corridors for predators, and nest failures increase significantly. When the contiguous forest canopy is broken, sun and wind impact soil moisture, and those changes impact the insect population that provides critical protein for newly hatched baby birds. The Native American wisdom that proclaims, touch one strand and the whole web trembles, surely applies to what is happening in Pennsylvania's forests. I'd like to show you just a few of Pennsylvania's endangered species. Of course, this threat of extinction is not to be blamed entirely on the fossil fuel industry. However, their presence in our forests and bogs and woodlands and wetlands makes that threat all the more serious. Scarlet tanager, northern flying squirrel, white trout lily, short-eared owl, brown nose and long-eared bat. There are some of you in this room that came to a hearing on the bat that was held at the Genetti Hotel a year or so ago. We were trying to help the little bats out that are already suffering greatly from white nose syndrome, and the gas industry had applied for a permit to kill more of them. Purple rocket flower, 4 species of freshwater mussel, the eastern hellbender salamander. I used to see these in the Loyalsock when I was a kid. We saw quite a few of them. I haven't seen one for many, many years. The red-bellied dace, the northern American bog turtle, the black chin shiner, and the eastern spadefoot toad. Sadly, this is not a complete list of the animals and plants that are under threat in our state. It's not just the polar bears. We are choking the planet in plastic. Everything from water bottles to grocery shopping bags are polluting our waterways and endangering marine life in the natural environment. But what's less well known is that fracking for methane is the driving force behind this plastics binge. In less than a decade, tens of billions of dollars have been invested in creating new manufacturing sites to turn fossil fuels into resin pellets used to manufacture plastic products. This slide shows an ethylene cracker plant under construction right now in Beaver County, Pennsylvania, out in western PA. In competition with Ohio and West Virginia for the plant, Governor Corbett lured Royal Dutch Shell to Pennsylvania with the promise of a $1.6 billion tax credit to build this cracker plant. And that credit will come over 2 decades and is the largest tax exemption ever in our state's history. Over $1.5 billion that Royal Dutch Shell will not have to pay. The U.S. Geological Survey released the first comprehensive maps pinpointing more than a dozen areas in central and eastern U.S. that had been jolted by quakes that the researchers said were triggered by deep shale drilling. The report said that man-made quakes tied to industry operations have been on the rise and are mainly attributed to the spike in what you see here, which is an injection well. And by injecting fracking waste deep underground, we hope that it is out of sight, out of mind, but this can cause a problem with dormant faults and activate them. Thus far, Pennsylvania has seen very little change in seismic activity. Although we create more fracking waste than any other state except Texas, we have been shipping our wastewater largely out of state, but unfortunately change is on the horizon. 11 injection wells have now been permitted by DEP. and many industry watchdogs believe we are in for hundreds more in the future. To get an idea of the earthquake potential when states provide injection wells to deal with toxic waste, we can look to Oklahoma. Prior to 2008, Oklahoma historically recorded an average of 1.5 quakes of a magnitude of 3.0 or greater each year. That's 1.5 quakes per year. In 2013, after the fracking boom hit, Oklahoma recorded an average of 2.5 quakes each day. And in 2015, the Oklahoma State geologist recorded a total of 7,000 earthquakes in the state of Oklahoma. The preponderance of science pointing to man-made climate change is irrefutable. Methane is a more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, and the global warming effect of methane is 84 to 87 times that of CO2 over a 20-year period. This figure comes from the EPA. The big push in Pennsylvania right now is for gas-fired electric power plants. There are currently 48 such plants permitted, some of which are online, others are under construction, and nationwide power plants use more than 1/3 of the methane consumed in the United States. That volume is expected to increase considerably as market forces drive the replacement of coal with cheaper gas. Researchers at Purdue University very recently published a study in the Journal of Environmental Science and Technology showing that natural gas power plants release up to 120 times more methane than earlier estimates. It is ironic that Purdue University published this study the very same week that President Trump proposed a cut to the EPA that included a 23% cut to the Enforcement Division tasked with, you guessed it, testing methane emissions at gas-fired power plants. Just last week, State Impact published the results of a research study funded in part by DEP that shows methane leaks in Pennsylvania are 5 times higher than the industry is reporting. This is not necessarily the industry being untruthful. The problem is that the industry is understating their emissions because they report them based on formulas created by the EPA. These formulas estimate how much methane a well will leak based on what kind of equipment the company is using. However, researchers in this study did not use the mathematical formulas. They went out into the field and measured the methane. Boots on the ground told a very different story than algorithms done on a computer in an office. These researchers discovered an abnormally high number of leaky wells and dubbed them super emitters, wells that are responsible for this very widespread disparity between reported and actual methane emissions. The topic of tighter methane emission regulations is right now being discussed in Harrisburg. Gives us one more question to ask candidates for office and elected representatives, and one more area of concern to keep an eye on. Another climate change impact of methane drilling that can't be overlooked is the staggering release of carbon into the atmosphere that comes from clearing the forest. Known as carbon sequestration, one of the many gifts provided by forested terrain is the process by which atmospheric carbon dioxide is taken up by trees and plants through photosynthesis and stored as carbon in biomass and in soils. As you may remember from an earlier slide, for each well pad, the acres of forest cleared averages 30 by the time all of the infrastructure is in place. A single acre of forest sequesters 158,000 pounds of organic carbon. Thus, if located in a forested area, a single well pad is responsible for the release of 4,740,000 pounds of CO2 into the atmosphere. Multiply this nearly 5 million pound number by the thousands upon thousands of wells the industry hopes to drill in the Marcellus and Utica shales of Pennsylvania. I've thrown a lot of information out there at you in a very short time. You will each process this differently based on your own experience. You will gravitate to what most resonates with you and with your concerns and with your values. I would, however, like to leave you with one final point to ponder. There is an utterly false and yet very widely accepted fallacy that economics and the environment are competing forces. For one to win, the other must lose. This foundational belief drives political will, and we remain caught in a system that privatizes profits and socializes costs. Corporations, in this case the fossil fuel industry and its investors, pocket the profits, while the tremendous cost of environmental degradation and the health consequences suffered by those in harm's way are borne by individuals and families and taxpayers, both now and for generations to come. Researchers point to the fact that over 9 million Americans now are at greater risk for life-threatening cancers because they live in areas directly impacted by the toxic emissions of nearby oil and gas sites. What is the financial, social, and emotional cost of just one case of cancer, much less the estimated 9 million to come? Protecting the environment is, in the end, an economic win-win. If our elected officials embraced this truth, sustainability would actually become a national priority and not a politically dirty word. I look at my grandchildren and believe that such a great shift of consciousness may be their only hope. I'll wrap this up by giving you my contact information, inviting you to stay informed on this issue by visiting the RDA website and subscribing to the newsletter that I have served as an editor and writer for the past 8 years. Again, thank you for your attention.